But please make sure to like and subscribe to Pancreas. He's awesome, makes really good videos. Now it's time for dwarves.
I can't tell if this is poisoning the well right out of the gate or not, but I find myself relating to the dwarfs more as I grow older. They live underground and are fairly isolationist. I hate leaving my house. They love themselves a good brew. I'm an alcoholic. They have...
I was gonna say, like, kind of sounds like a VTuber. It is. Wait a second. It is a VTuber because you know what? All VTubers are men with beards and voice changers. I actually don't think dwarves would use a voice changer, but stay inside. Don't touch grass. Beards. Can confirm, I definitely 100% have a beard.
long beards. Give it a few more years and a beard will be the only hair I'll be able to grow on my head. Truly, there has never been a fantasy race I relate to more. But in all seriousness that I can bring myself to be, the dwarfs of Warhammer Fantasy are a great version of the dwarf archetype. Given how old this setting is, there's an argument to be made that they're foundational to it. They've got all the greatest hits, but that bit of Warhammer spice too.
Alright, calm down, chat. There's no need to call me short.
Argument to be made that they're foundational to it. They've got all the greatest hits, but that bit of Warhammer spice too, to make sure they stand out above the rest. I mean, come on now, we all know dwarfs are industrious craftsmen, but how often do you see them with helicopters? I'd wager not very often. The dwarfs of Warhammer Fantasy bring forth the best of arms, armor, and more to the hellish world they live in. They're outnumbered exponentially by basically everyone else, they're hamstrung by their own culture and traditions. But by God, if is it impressive to see an army of armored Dowie on the warpath ready to kick someone's teeth in, because 1,000 years ago, their great-great-great-grandpa called a dwarf a moderately rude name. So tell me, viewer, do you like advanced technology while at the same time hating advanced technology?
Is that McCason? Sorry, there's a character, and he's kind of like a mad scientist guy, and he's a slayer. Okay, I've not looked up Art of McCason, but I figured that was what he looked like.
Do you like writing anything wrong done to you, even if it'd really be better to just let it go?
In my
Are
diary.
You short? Then why don't you see if the dwarfs of Warhammer Fantasy are the army for you? But before I begin, do you know if you're browsing the internet safely or with any real degree of privacy? Well, if you're like most people, the answer is probably not really. Well, if you want a surefire way to be sure of that, the sponsor of this video, ExpressVPN, can help with that. ExpressVPN has quite a few uses, but the main ones are online privacy, data security, and content unblocking. Did you know that in the US, your data is free to be sold to basically anyone by your internet service provider, and in the UK and Australia, they keep logs of whatever website you visit for 1 to 2 years? Well, ExpressVPN can shut all this down by encrypting and rerouting 100% of your network traffic through their secure servers, so your browsing history is kept private from corporations like your ISP, advertisers, or data brokers. As someone who doesn't enjoy companies knowing their every single move, this is quite nice. Also, because of the encryption I mentioned, ExpressVPN does more than keep your information private. It also keeps you safe from would-be hackers and thieves who might be on the same Wi-Fi, which is a feature good for anyone logging onto a public Wi-Fi who doesn't want some random schmuck deciding they now have unfiltered access to your debit card. And of course, it lets you unblock content from around the world. Most streaming platforms like Netflix have different content libraries based on the country you log in from, with some countries outright restricting access to I was so annoyed. One time I went on a trip out of the country and I wanted to watch a show. And I didn't realize they did this. And so I was watching, like, I wanted to watch my show in another country and it wouldn't let me. I was like, what? I was kind of upset. Because I was bored. I didn't have anything else to do. A lot of media that the rest of the world has access to. Did you know that Return of the King is not available on US Netflix? Well, I didn't until I was very confused one day and wanted to watch it. Well, with ExpressVPN, now my fellow Americans can simply switch themselves over to another country and watch it to their heart's content.
Yes.
And of course, ExpressVPN is also the fastest VPN around, can connect up to 14 devices simultaneously, and is rated #1 by CNET, The Verge, and PC World, among several others, just for a few more things it has going for it. To keep your internet history and data secure, accept no substitutes. Find out how you can get up to 4 extra months by clicking the link in the description box below, scanning the QR code on screen, or by going to expressvpn.com/pancreas. You can never be too safe online, so get ExpressVPN today to make sure you're as safe as you can possibly be.
Sorry.
Now then, get ready to strike a grudge from the book and add 10 more, because as we all know...
But the great book of grudges remains full.
As with most of the other fantasy races, the dwarfs get their start as a creation of the Old Ones. If memory serves, they're actually the second race created after the Old Ones declared the elves weren't quite what they wanted. The elves of fantasy wielded amazing arcane might, but they were too frail and potentially prone to just following their own random whims to be reliable enough to achieve guaranteed wins against chaos. With that in mind, the Old Ones basically went the complete opposite route with the dwarfs. They created a race of sturdy beings that could hold fast against anything, one who not only couldn't use magic, but in a sufficient enough gathering of dwarfs, magic outright won't work on them. They made them so they'd always uphold their debts and keep their bargains, being that could never be enthralled by Chaos's schemes. Unfortunately, course-correcting so hard to the other end of the spectrum wasn't what the Old Ones wanted either. Their stubbornness and adherence to tradition kept Chaos from corrupting them, but it turned out to be limiting when Chaos pulled out their trickier schemes. Not being able to use magic and focusing on material crafts did help them create some damn fine wonders, including harnessing magic in the safest way possible, but it ended up being more of a weakness than anything at the end of the day. Turns out, being able to throw fireballs the size of houses at people is really helpful when demons are attacking. Also, while they can't be corrupted really, they can still freely join Chaos if they want. As proof, see the Chaos Dwarfs. But they weren't an abject failure, same as the elves, so the Old Ones let them keep existing and gave them the mountains of the world to call home. As for the dwarf version of their origins, they don't take into account anything on the Old Ones or anything of the sort. Kinda funny in a way, because the elves, at least in some regards, are very much aware of the Old Ones and even have conversations about how that affects their religion sometimes.
Oh, that's
but
interesting.
No, the dwarfs in their own stories say they were shaped from the mountains by the first dwarfs, the beings that would become their ancestor gods. They were the gods Grimnir, Grungni, and the goddess Valaya. Grimnir was a war god, bringing low the enemies of the dwarfs and keeping his children safe. Grungni taught the dwarfs the secrets of runesmithing, how to capture magic and magical runes for safe use. And Valaya did everything.
That makes a lot of sense, because in Demon Slayer, there is, spoilers, there is a giant blimp that they call the Spirit of Grumni. And I didn't know that Grumni was, you know, one of their gods. But that makes a lot of sense, given the context.
Else. I am not exaggerating. She was also apparently married to both Grimnir and Grungni, which is how the dwarf race came to be, meaning that aside from the fact inbreeding started rather quickly in this tale, it also means that just about every dwarf can be said to in some way relate to their gods directly. When Chaos showed up, unlike some of the other races, the dwarfs did not take the fight to the demons. Grimnir did, I guess, but in spite of being a god, he is just one dwarf. The dwarfs as a whole had a different approach. Shut the gates to their holds, bolt the locks, and resoundingly declare it was not their problem outside. Grimnir marched north to the realm of chaos. Valaya locked herself in a vault to gather magical strength, since she was a god and magic is allowed to her apparently, and I don't actually think Grungni did anything too special. Eventually things calmed down due to the efforts of the elves and lizardmen, and the dwarfs re-emerged. From there, the two elder races of the elves and dwarfs would meet, and things were good. While the dwarfs had made contact with man, this was the Tomb Kings who compared to them were fairly primitive. Presumably this happened after Cetra had already passed away, as otherwise he would have wiped the floor with the entirety of the Karazhan Corps for their dismissive attitude towards his people. And to be fair to the dwarfs, it was mostly contact with pre-Empire Old World humanity, so barbarians and cavemen. But the elves were another advanced and cultured race, and so they got along just fine. Especially cavemen. But the elves were another advanced and cultured race, and so they got along just fine. Special mention to Malekith and the dwarf who, spoiler alert, would become Grombrindle, as they had such a legendary friendship that the future Dark Elf King was allowed to bear witness to the dwarf's death. The elves learned how to build and engineer better than ever, and the dwarfs, with the elves' help, refined their runecraft to unparalleled levels. Things were good. And then, it was all downhill for the dwarfs. By contrast, even the elves at least have brief periods where they can rebuild just a little bit. The dwarfs would go through sacktap after sacktap until basically the end of the setting. It started small with some cracks in the alliance with the elves, or rather now the High Elves, since Malekith and Morathi had already taken their followers to Nagaroth by this point. Dwarf cultural differences with the elves sometimes made meetings awkward. I'm sure you've seen the scene with Legolas and Gimli drinking.
Love that.
Elves are refined and fairly low-key as far as social situations go, with small gestures speaking volumes to them, and they typically don't cause massive scenes. Dwarves love chugging barrels of booze at every noteworthy occasion and are loud and happy to get in your face. Not in a rude way, or at least a malicious way, but they're a very boastful and, again, loud people. Little social differences like that piled up, but relations were still mostly good. The dwarfs supposedly even helped out the High Elves a bit when the Dark Elves first formed, not really understanding the idea of a civil war, but they did at least help out the Asur with some arms for cheaper costs. Then things got worse. The Grudge of Drong was an old Warhammer Fantasy box
Oh.
whose lore set the stage for what was to come. TLDR, the two dwarf holds went to war, the elves went to help one of the holds as they were trading partners, and then the two warring dwarfs decided to beat the snot out of the elves together instead. So tensions were getting a bit worse and would culminate a few decades after this. On the dwarf side, we have High King Gotrek Starbreaker. He was neither a slayer nor, that Gotrek, but the few images we have of him are giving...
I was like, okay, cool.
away the ending a bit, so pretend he just looked like the Gotrek everyone knows for a little. He was a pretty reasonable king.
Cool.
Solid guy all around, I'd say. On the elf side, we have Kalidor II, who is best known by the elves for being a colossal screw-up, and as for the dwarfs, they remember him by having two different titles for him to say he has sex with animals. He was arrogant to the extreme, and shall we say a little racially
Because these are his coward, friendless, irredeemable, thin, goat lover, goat warrior. That's kind of funny. Frightened of loud noises. Zapale the princess. Yikes. This is not a good list, man.
sensitive, not caring for the dwarfs. Malekith saw this little prick was in charge and hatched a plan to divide the high elves and dwarfs so in his future invasions of Ulthuan, the dwarfs wouldn't help. It worked, but far better than he could ever have hoped for. Malekith had some dark elf assassins dress up as high elves and attack dwarf caravans, leaving behind evidence to make it look like high elves did it.
Oh,
Classic
bro.
false flag attack stuff. Gotrek Starbreaker initially responded incredibly calmly, especially for a dwarf, because in a missive to the Phoenix King, Kalidor, all he asked for in recompense was an explanation as to what happened. All Kalidor 2 needed to do was say, hey, that civil war problem we had a while ago was kind of kept going, and they did it. That's it. And if he wanted to be nice, maybe a fruit basket for the families of the dead dwarfs. Instead, he didn't even meet with the ambassadors of this inferior race.
What?
Now Gotrek was being insulted, and naturally a bit suspicious, so he now demanded
That's
payment in
stupid.
gold for what was lost as well as for the dead dwarfs. This is, again, still a completely reasonable request.
Yeah.
Kalidor 2 responded by shaving the ambassador's beard. You don't do that to a dwarf, and now
That's so bad. You don't do that. Look, I don't know a lot about dwarfs, but like you don't do that. You done messed up. You've messed up. Oh god, it gets worse. No, it can't.
it's time for bloodshed. Oh, and you don't need to worry about those dark elf assassins from the beginning anymore, by the way. I'm sure they won't cause the world any more catastrophic harm by helping give rise to, say, the father of necromancy.
Oh,
the War of
yeah.
the Beard to the High Elves and War of Vengeance to the Dwarfs began, essentially fantasy World War I. The two sides decimated each other, with high elf colonies burning and dwarf holds being reduced to rubble. The war ended with Gotrek cutting off Kalidor's head and taking the Phoenix Crown, officially
Honestly,
striking out the grudge that caused the war. But
Yeah.
the war had shattered the trust the races had in each other, and for the dwarfs put many more entries into the Book of Grudges than were crossed out. Never again would the dwarfs and elves trust each other, now regarding each other as natural enemies rather than what should be the greatest of friends.
That's a shame.
And then, as I said, things got worse. The Time of Woes began, which from the name I'm sure you can guess how that's gonna go. The start of the Time of
Yep.
Woes began with two events colliding, one fairly innocuous on paper, and one that was a Skaven project, so you already know that's evil. For the former, the Slann were looking at some plaques and decided the feng shui of the planet needed a bit of realigning. The Slann being Slann, this was done by physically moving entire bits of the planet around, primarily mountains. Dwarf holds are
Oh.
sturdy, but not so sturdy that if someone started moving a mountain a few dozen feet to the left, there wouldn't be tremendous damage. That on its own
Yeah,
already would
that's
have been
rough.
awful, but the Skaven simultaneously decided to expand Skavendom a decent bit, with some extremely large machine or other. The Skaven being the Skaven, the machine blew up, which did expand their tunnel networks, but also somehow blew up across almost every mountain in the old world. I think it also actually killed most of the Skaven alive at the time, but that was
Yeah, it
undone in a
has
month
to, right?
tops, and more importantly for this video, it blew apart what was left of a lot of the dwarfs' holdings. The Underway, the underground highway they used to connect their entire civilization, was in many parts completely collapsed or flooded with
Yeah,
lava,
that's
and just about
really
all of
bad.
it sustained heavy damage. Entire holds collapsed outright between these two events. And worst of all of this damage paved the way for massive amounts of greenskins to get access to dwarf holds. Countless of them fell over the span of just a few years, including to the opportunistic
this is
Skaven,
rough.
who
I
figured
didn't
they might
realize-
as well take advantage of this happy little accident.
I didn't realize they had it so bad.
A few hundred years later, Carrick 8 Peaks, the second greatest hold they had, also falls to goblin attacks. This particular hold would then, for the rest of the setting's history, become a never-ending three-way battle between goblins, Skaven, and the dwarfs trying to reclaim it. They did for a little while have a Silver Age beginning around year 0 of the Empire of Man's calendar, which is no coincidence as it was in part brought about by Sigmar helping them clear out plenty of greenskins from their territory.
Very
Sigmar
based
really
and
hated
cool.
orcs, possibly more than he did chaos, so he had no problem lending a hand when they asked. Quite frankly, I imagine they probably would have to sometimes tell him to chill out and take it slow after he would dive into the deepest pit of a hold like that one meme of Kratos free-falling. Some new inventions were made and things were all around pretty alright. Then it was back to slowly losing ground inch by inch against greenskins and Skaven, because they had their chance to breathe, so it was time for the sack taps to come back. By the time of the Great War against Chaos, which is only a few years ahead of where the Old World is at the moment in the timeline, the dwarfs were in perhaps the worst spot they'd ever been in. Millennia of losing territory to their enemies and the slow dwindling of their population has left the Dawi facing the fall of their empire for good. They're a disunited people, with the Great War against Chaos as reigning High King, making specific note of the fact that many of the lesser kings of the dwarfs were not nearly as helpful against the threat as they should have been. Things do not look good for the everlasting realm, but fear not. Though diminished, they've made sure that every inch they lose is covered in the blood of their enemies before it's lost.
I like this art.
A single dwarf warrior may fall, but it'll take 10 greenskins or Skaven down with him as he does. Their armor is unmatched, their weapons the pinnacle of engineering in the world, and their spirit unbroken still. The dwarfs are on the warpath, and though this is cheating with meta-knowledge a bit, in a few decades a youngish dwarf named Thorgrim will return to start the Age of Reckoning and bring a fervor not seen in thousands of years back to this ailing people. And maybe, just maybe, your army will be ready for him when he comes. Let's see if they're the army for you now, how about? First off for this bit, the dwarfs are pretty standard dwarfs. That might sound like a backhanded statement, but I don't mean it as such.
No, I
like classic fantasy archetypes,
not
and as much as Age of
backhanded.
Sigmar making things like the Kharadron Overlords is cool as hell, sometimes I just want to have a dwarf. And these guys sure enough fit that archetype perfectly. They're expert craftsmen who place great value on their work, live underground, tunneling through the mountains for riches. They're greedy little bastards, but honest in their word, and when they give you an oath, you better believe they'll do everything in their power in order to fulfill it.
I really
It's
like
cool to
that
see.
side of
If that's
them.
the kind of vibe you love too, then
Yes.
you know better than these brave dwarfs. But they still have that Warhammer spice to keep them interesting. In this case, a lot of it is exaggerating dwarf characteristics to extreme levels. All dwarfs are craftsmen and love a good smithing project. In Warhammer, dwarfs creating magical runes involves the most esoteric nonsense on the planet that must be done in order to do it right. They must perfectly carve the rune, and the metal they've engraved it into must be cooled at exactly midnight on the 3rd Saturday of the 12th month by dipping it into troll's blood backwards. Dwarfs in all settings love a good drink. There's a unit in the
I
game
like
that
that.
makes dwarfs move faster because they want to catch up to it. It's a beer cart. Dwarf beer in Warhammer Fantasy can also be used to feed a dwarf for days, or as fuel for vehicles. Good luck if you ever try any. And of course, grudges must be mentioned. No proper dwarf in any setting will accept a slight against them, but in Warhammer Fantasy,
Good.
the dwarfs are psychologically incapable of letting bygones be bygones. They will demand immediate restitution, and if such is not settled, into the Book of Grudges goes the offense. It's very simple. Once a grudge is entered, there are typically only 2 ways to complete it. Sometimes a price in gold or material will be accepted as payment for a grudge. It can theoretically be as simple as that. In practice, most grudges are solved with the death of the offending party. And while some dwarf fans will likely say this is exaggeration or only limited to some of the goofier bits of lore, allow me to tell you some of the more fantastical grudges. I'm sure you're familiar with
yes.
people in fiction listing off reasons someone sucks while they hand them their ass. See Goku beating the shit out of Frieza, among plenty of other examples. In the end times, and this is one of those few end times moments where it was awesome, Thorgrim killed the Skaven character Queek Headtaker while listing off every single thing he did to earn a grudge. Badass, but not too silly yet. Well, consider this one Godric and Felix side character. He was a dwarf who said he hadn't spoken to his cousin in decades and had him in his own personal book of grudges because he didn't pay a bar tab once. There was an instance where a human
gosh.
city accidentally shorted the dwarfs 2 coins on payment for building it, whereupon the dwarf settled the grudge by leveling the entire city.
Yeah.
Even in universe, some dwarfs dispute this tale, but it's important to note that just as many dwarfs consider it a valuable lesson on why you should never short a dwarf.
Yeah.
But of course, the ultimate
Short?
to me is a
Short?
grudge against a mountain. A landslide killed a bunch of dwarfs once, whereupon they swore revenge against the goddamn mountain, and then strip-mined it to pieces. It doesn't matter that dwarfs aren't fast. If they say they're coming to get revenge, you can be damn sure they're on their way to at least try. And just to top it off, the great book of grudges their High King has not only has the greatest of all wrongs against the dwarf people in it, but new entries are written in the High King's blood. Imagine pissing someone off so much they cut open their hand and start writing just what you did with their blood so they can take revenge later on. That's awesome. If you hate the idea of anyone wronging you and getting away with it, you're a dwarf player, and you just don't know it yet. Aside from that, they also differ from dwarfs in the extremes they take their engineering skills. Dwarf engineering usually means some fairly mundane stuff, all things considered. The finest of blades and armor, that kind of deal. In Warhammer Fantasy, the dwarfs have helicopters. They have flamethrowers and cannons that can rip asunder anyone who looks at them funny, with technology basically no one else can hope to match. The Skaven in theory surpass dwarf tech, but dwarf tech has the advantage of not blowing up.
They only surpass it in theory because they've got warpstone, which maybe makes it do more damage.
You look at it wrong. So if you like the idea of being technologically advanced in a fantasy setting, but also dislike the idea of your tech being as volatile as, well, Skaven technology, then the dwarfs are for you. Bit of an odd one here, but I'd say the dwarfs are also perfect for fans of the Roman Empire, or those who appreciate playing as a long-standing, powerful empire in general. Much of the scientific and religious language of the empire, for example, is in Khazalid, the language of the dwarfs. They've given the empire much of the foundations of what it would become, and they themselves have streaks of the Byzantine Empire amongst themselves. They're a remnant of a bygone era where they ruled much of the world, and though weakened, still continue to influence the world in a variety of ways and have no small amount of military force backing them up. If that idea speaks to you, I'd recommend the dwarfs too. They're also firmly on the good guy side of things, if in that Warhammer way where they still do plenty of brutal killing, like that 2 coins for a city business earlier. Dwarfs don't actually like war. They try to avoid it, and remember that the goddess who gave them most of their culture and civilization was not a war goddess. Per Barden and Vermintide, among other sources, Valaya is most pleased when you're welcoming someone into your house and offering them a pint of beer.
That sounds
When they go
great.
to war, it isn't just for the sake of glory, though of course dwarfs are happy to seek some glory. They do it to avenge wrongs to their people, to set right what they believe to be a fundamental wrongdoing. Anything that isn't that kind of war is them crusading against genuine threats to all that is good, such as vampires and chaos. Plenty of grudges are by our standards nonsense and should just be gotten over, which is something I'll return to later. But I would argue that there's not a single dwarf grudge that was pursued out of selfish desires, at least in the sense of only inflating someone else's pockets or whatever and using it as a motivation.
Okay, fair.
And
I was
beyond
gonna
that,
say
they help the other races when they can. Even the elves they helped, as the modern day of Warhammer Fantasy rolled around and Thorgrim Grudgebearer took the seat of High King. They're the reason the Empire is still around. They taught mankind smithing, how to make gunpowder and weapons, how to make buildings that weren't animal skin tents. They are the reason the Empire is great, because among the 3...
So they taught humans, like, a ton of stuff. Like, the really, really, really important stuff that you need to, like, make sure your city survives, your civilization survives. Dang, humans could not figure out how to build things with stones. That's a bit shameful.
Things that make it great. Without the dwarfs, they'd have no steel or gunpowder. Only faith, and faith alone does not drive back the chaos hordes. For all that dwarf culture has issues, they are firmly on the side of good, so if you think those players reveling in chaotic carnage need a good sack tap of their own, the dwarfs are right up your alley. Dwarfs are also an excellent pick for those of you who want a good comeback or underdog story. There is no race as down on their luck as the dwarfs are. While the Empire is always besieged, it is also repeatedly stated to be the greatest nation of men in the entire old world. And beyond that, mankind being dominant in Warhammer Fantasy is not an uncommon theme to hear about. It's constantly under threat from all sides, but at the end of the day, mankind is fine, even if the Empire may not be. Disregarding the end times, of course, as always. Even the High Elves are fairly safe on a moment-to-moment basis, being thousands of miles away from most threats on their island of Ulthuan. The Dwarfs, meanwhile, in some hold or other, are pretty much always under attack. They fight Skaven and Greenskins the most, but they fight just about everyone else plenty too. Chaos is a frequent enemy, but even the undead will seek to raid dwarf holds as well, if only because zombies in dwarf armor will be quite a bit sturdier than what they normally are. The deck is stacked against them. That hasn't stopped the dwarfs from playing a winning hand before, and it won't stop you either. Are you a stubborn asshole? Because the dwarfs are great for you then. They just do not give up, and I don't just mean on the battlefield. They will refuse to admit they are wrong unless you can essentially get one of their gods to tell them otherwise. Their ways are set in stone. They will follow those ways, and anything to the contrary is irrelevant. You could show a dwarf a mathematical equation on why some some aspects of how they do things in their day-to-day life is objectively hurting them, and they'll just call you a wazzock and probably write you in their personal book of grudges afterwards.
Oof.
I'm sure you can see how this can cause them no small amount of trouble in the cons section later, but there is something to be said about sticking to your guns. They may die in whatever hill they choose to, but chances are they'll take you with them. And for a final lore positive, do you hate elves with 99% of your heart? Everything about those prancy little princesses pisses you off to no end, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you that the dwarfs are right up your alley. Part of an old dwarf saying is that if you mistrust an elf, you can do no wrong. They do not like the elves. Even after the Old World's era in the timeline, when the elf Finnabar was repairing relations, most dwarves would still happily take their axes to the first elf they saw. In one of the Gotrek and
Yikes.
Felix books, Gotrek nearly allowed a magical artifact to be used to essentially drown the coastlines of the Old World. His reason for this? Because it would also drown Ulthuan, which would be entirely worth it for all the dead elves. If you hate elves more than almost
Oh my
anyone, just play
gosh.
dwarfs. You'll be content.
I didn't know that.
Of course, I said almost anyone, and hating them with 99% of your heart,
Wow.
because no one hates elves more than Pellinal Whitestrake. I'm sorry, dwarf players, but you simply cannot match the wrath of the Shezarene.
I'm torn because I really like dwarves because, like, sorry, dwarfs. Keep saying dwarves. Because, like, I like that they're honorable, they're upright, and, you know, the grudges thing is kind of whatever, but I like their vibe in general, but I also like elves. I mean, you're allowed to like both, but it feels like you're not supposed to like both because they're so diametrically opposed. I really like both, but I think I like lean a little bit more towards elves. My first crush was Legolas from you know, Lord of the Rings. So I feel like that set me on a path, and I don't think I can recover from it, unfortunately.
Because I have some anger to work through, let's go over some special things about them before I go over the basics.
I don't know
First
anything
off,
about tabletop
dwarves can't
stuff.
take any generic magical items in the rulebook. Instead, they can get powerful runic magic items, which essentially act as the same thing, with the rulebook even stating that the same rules for them apply to runic items as well. With that said, there's also 5 more caveats to go over. 1. No item can have more than 3 runes on it, obviously for balancing, but in the lore it's because nothing can handle more than that much runic magic. 2.
Okay.
You have to put runes on their corresponding equipment. No putting an armor rune on a weapon, lest you break with sacred tradition. Maybe it also just can't work like that, but I'm assuming any dwarf who tries something like that, even if it could work, is in for a 10-hour-long dressing down at the least. 3. You can't repeat rune combinations, be that for loadouts of 1, 2, or 3 runes. You can have the same rune multiple times, but if one model only has it and nothing else, another model better have another rune to go with it. This is outright called the Rune of Pride, and the explanation is that runesmiths are prideful shits who don't like people copying their work. 4. Each master rune can only be used
I
once
love
per
that.
army. And 5. Unless specifically stated otherwise, you can't stack multiple of the same rune. This was a rather lengthy explanation for a single thing as small as this, relatively speaking, and the reason for that is because dwarf runes are absolutely insane. For 100
What do they
points,
do?
give someone a toughness characteristic of 10. Those of you from 40k might be thinking, well, that ain't too high. Yes, it is. Toughness alongside every other stat caps out at 10 in the old world. You
No,
can just give the
that's
highest
crazy.
toughness score in the game to some random asshole willy-nilly. Give
No, that's crazy. What the heck? That's busted. 100 points?
a model d6 wounds per attack in a game where a lord on a dragon barely reaches 10 wounds. Add an extra dice when dispelling an enemy spell. Dwarfs aren't just limited to runic items because they're dwarfs and can't use normal magic. They don't need normal magic items. As a final quick little note on runic magic here, runesmiths, rune lords, and the Anvil of Doom can dispel enemy spells. Runesmith dispels as if they were a level 1 wizard, rune lords level 2, and the Anvil of Doom a level 3 wizard. Now for the more general stuff that pisses me off. First off, toughness. If you want an army that just won't die, the dwarfs are an excellent choice. Heavy armor is basically army-wide, giving you an immediate 5-up armor save before anything else comes into play. Shields can easily bump that up to a 4-up save, and full plate armor isn't all that uncommon either, meaning a 3-up armor save is a frequent occurrence here. Again, for those of you watching primarily into 40k, the old world by comparison is not that lethal of a game. Chunking through a unit takes time unless it's a unit of like 5 dudes for some unknown reason. With the dwarf's armor save, that is going to take some time. But wait, it gets worse. Or better, I guess. Gromroll armor is a special rule a lot of dwarf models have. It lets them re-roll failed armor saves of 1. Now, follow me through on this thought exercise from hell. You have a unit of dwarf iron breakers armed with shields. They have a 3-up armor save and Gromroll armor, so they're re-rolling all of those save throws of 1.
Yes.
You are basically only taking wounds on a 2. Because
Pretty
if
much.
you roll a 1, you get another chance to roll a 3 or higher. If someone brings a bunch of archers against you if you run in this unit, laugh at them. Laugh as their shitty bowmen open fire against your iron breakers for 3 turns straight, only to take out a single guy the whole time. And I would know, because I was the guy getting laughed at. Basically, every dwarf infantry unit also counts as heavy infantry incidentally, meaning they only need to be lined up in a row of 4 models to get rank bonus. Very helpful. And with them all being toughness 4 at least, lighter strength models are going to have a hard time wounding them on that alone. Leadership is also a stat that dwarfs excel in. Leadership 9 is standard, because dwarfs can comprehend the horrors perfectly well and they simply aren't impressed by what they're seeing. In lore, sometimes longbeard dwarfs will loudly boast that the enemies they used to face were 10 times as strong as the pathetic enemies they do nowadays, such as the sheer stubborn heroism of this race. That's actually a mechanic where nearby units to longbeards can reroll failed panic tests, although again, with Leadership 9 minimum army-wide, you probably don't need it. I'm not gonna say that routing them is impossible, because in 2 games I've had something of mine chase down and slaughter fleeing dwarfs, but the majority of the time you can rest easy knowing your dwarfs are gonna be in the thick of combat and perfectly fine for it. The rules Stubborn and Resolute also help this in some ways. A lot of units have the Stubborn keyword, meaning they can choose to fall back in good order, while Resolute means they always subtract 1 from fleeing or pursuing rolls. Essentially, they aren't moving for anything even if the morale checks don't go your way and it's time to bug out. And even if that does happen, a lot of the time they won't flee outright, but instead just calmly march back a few paces and reform the battle line. Between this and the aforementioned toughness they have, moving a properly positioned dwarf battle line is going to be a monumental task. But of course, we aren't done with the various ways dwarfs tell their opponents to get bent. The entire army has at least magic resistance 1, with some units having magic resistance 2. While in some books this is taken to insane levels, like Godric and Malachi McKyson face-tanking a wizard's Kamehameha and calling him a bitch, this is still a nice and free way to ensure anyone running wizards against you is going to struggle that much more, if only if they keep trying to blast you with spells. Do take note that this doesn't help you against magical weapons. Those still hit you just fine.
The
range game is also excellent, as is fitting for an army outfitted with only the finest of crest warship. Quarrelers and Thunderers are fairly standard range units as far as crossbowmen and handgunners go, but they do have the dwarf-crafted special rule. If they shoot into a unit that's charging them, this rule means they don't have a -1 to hit. Not the most glamorous rule, but certainly helpful, and since they not only have heavy armor, but can either have shields or great weapons, they too aren't going down easy even if they do get charged. But their 5 pieces of artillery are really what makes them stand out. A bolt thrower is a cheap artillery piece that can cut through weaker elite units like butter, and if you're the asshole I played against the old world last time, you keep rolling 6s on your through and through rolls and obliterate an entire rank of swordmasters of Hoeth. A grudge thrower is a catapult you can put dwarf runes on to ruin someone's day with. The dwarf cannon is the same thing, but a cannon. Light it and beware anyone running monstrous units because
the artillery shell he's got
An
in
organ
there.
gun isn't actually too high in strength, but you get 2d6 hits every time you fire it. If you roll well on that and pick your targets right, you can potentially take out a good quarter of your opponent's army before the fighting has even started. And the flame cannon. Make anyone playing Tomb Kings against you feel very, very upset as you tell them where they can shove their regen save. I like how one of the crew has a little flag. He's really excited to be cooking you alive. For some final few touches, the dwarfs are all solid in melee. They aren't warriors of chaos or anything, but as I said with the ranged infantry earlier, they can all take great weapons if they want. Your heavy hitters like Iron Breakers of course are coming in strong, but even the basic warriors are going to be a bitch to fight if only because they've pretty much won the attrition game by default. And Slayers are pretty good once they get stuck in, with weapon skill 4 for normal ones and 5 for giant
Their
Slayers.
feet are massive.
Not only can they attack on
Holy
death,
cow.
but if you roll a 4 up to wound, you always wound, so their strength being 3 and 4 respectively isn't actually something to really worry about. You also have army-wide free hatred against greenskins for everyone.
Nice.
While I focused more on the elves earlier because it's funnier to most people, there isn't a single race the dwarfs hate more than the greenskins. In their mind, every dwarf travesty is either a direct result of the greenskins or came about from greenskins taking advantage of their weakened state. So during the first round of combat against a unit of greenskins, enjoy your free rerolls to hit without you having to actually do anything to get it. They've also got a few movement things to work with, so you better believe I'll be returning to the army as a whole on this front later. The miners can appear on another table edge than the rest of your army, or take a free move at the start of the game. And gyrocopters and gyrobombers are helicopters, so naturally they fly quick-ish in addition to dropping bombs on people you don't like. Their characters are also nice to see. Engineers make your artillery better, runelords and smiths give a unit flaming attacks, and kings and thanes are your standard lord choices. You can put them on an oathstone if you like, which means any challenges they issue can't be refused. A cool ability, and also that model is just Belagar Ironhammer. You can also use the guy carried by shield bearers, which not only counts as 4 models and can thus fill in the ranks of another unit, but is also
it definitely has a different vibe for a shield bearer. Usually you don't carry the guy and the shield at the same time, but I love it. It's such a vibe.
Nearly the only cavalry in the dwarf roster. Behold the pinnacle of dwarf horsemanship. You know it's dwarf cavalry because there's no actual horses involved. And the Slayers of Legends, for when you want something to die really badly and you don't mind the goofy striped pants. And to end on named characters, let's start with Ungrim Ironfist. He has a 4-up armor save and 5-up ward, he has toughness 6, and he has a weapon skill of 9. There are a variety of things Ungrim does, and for the Slayer army, he's the named lord choice. But to keep things simple, here's how you use Ungrim. Find an enemy model you don't like. Send Ungrim after it. When he eventually gets there, it dies. If you want to try and make Slayers work, he's your best bet. Burlock Dammonson is GW reaching into their bag of old lore and pulling out this fella. He's a better engineer, basically. Not the most spectacular of things like Ungrim is, but it's hard to go wrong with that kind of thing, especially in an artillery-heavy list like the Expeditionary Force Detachment. And to round us off, Thorgrim Ulliksson. You likely know him better by his future last name, Grudge Bearer. He may not be High King yet, but the grudges will be settled, and indeed Thorgrim's Grudge Lore rule and Grudgestone weapon mean that at any point, the unit he's in becomes unbreakable to completely ignore morale and gains hatred. Everyone. He has a ward save against Killing Blow and multiple wounds attacks just to make sure he doesn't get sniped immediately, and the Grudge Settler melee weapon, which is a fairly high strength multi-wound weapon with some AP. Grudges will be settled, and the dwarfs will never rout under his command. As a final tabletop upside, most of the dwarf models have held up quite nicely. Dwarfs are short guys in heavy armor, and sure enough, that's most of the dwarfs roster. They don't have the most dynamic opposes, but they don't need them more than any other army. They're dwarfs in a rank and flank game. I want a solid unbreaking line of metal, and they provide. I promise I will attempt to keep my elven sensibilities in check here. Let's start off with an easy one. The dwarfs are well past their prime. That isn't anything too uncommon with fantasy. In fact, it's the standard for pretty much everyone that isn't a human, chaos, or an ogre. But it's really bad with the dwarfs because, as I said, they've never really gotten many chances to take a breath and recover. They had that Silver Age sort of deal where new inventions popped up and Sigmar helped them out, and then it was back to misery. They've been fighting every step of the way and never go down easy, and on a meta level, Thorgrim's ascension to High King is a spot of hope for them that's relatively speaking right around the corner. But even then, the path forward for the dwarfs is harder than any other, so if you don't want an army that the lore seems determined to hurt, you'd best look elsewhere. Not helping this is the next multi-part point, which is that the dwarfs are not helping themselves with their attitudes towards, well, a lot. Let's start with grudges. Grudges are very cool. No one will ever say otherwise.
Yes,
I certainly won't at least. But dwarfs simply do not let them go. Grudges will be made for the smallest of things sometimes, as I discussed earlier, but even when a grudge is completely warranted, pursuing it may not be. The problem goes like this. A dwarf creates a grudge due to a wrongdoing, and I'll be kind here and say that it is justified. To right it, they marshal their forces and march out against the enemy. There's every chance they'll fail and the army is wiped out, which obviously weakens them. Alternatively, they succeed. Hooray, grudge wiped. In the process of striking it out of the book, they no doubt still took casualties, creating more grudges that have to be wronged. In this way, have the dwarves spiraled into having a book of grudges that can never be fulfilled without creating twice as many to erase later. And that's assuming the grudge written actually makes sense and isn't them being petty. But of course, there is literally no word for forgiveness in the dwarf language.
It's really cool, but it is their greatest flaw and tragedy. It makes them who they are, but it's like their Achilles heel. Pride.
They cannot let bygones be bygones, even when they should just accept losses and move on. Aside from this meaning they've only continued digging the hole they find themselves in, it also makes dealing with them potentially dangerous and can be off-putting to other races. The wrong word might end with a strong alliance turning into bitter enemies because you called one of them a bit short-tempered without really thinking that phrase through. There being no word for forgiveness doesn't just extend to other races, though. No. It extends to themselves, too. What do you think a Slayer is? Those are what happens when a dwarf does something that cannot be forgiven no matter what, be it by themselves or society at large.
Feels really
Given how
bad.
clannish dwarfs are, that difference by and large doesn't exist. If a dwarf goes too far, they shave most of their head, dye the remaining mohawk red or orange, and go find something to kill until something kills them. Funerals are held for slayers because they're going to die, it's just a matter of when. Once you've crossed the line in dwarf society, there is no coming back, and no matter how promising a career you might have had, or even if you might have otherwise somehow saved the dwarfs from their degradation, it doesn't matter. You will be dying in battle. The most extreme thing happened when the dwarfs discovered the Chaos Dwarfs, because they just skipped right over the Slayer Oath part.
Yeah.
Every direct family member of one of the Chaos Dwarfs killed themselves out of shame. All of the above is
Bro, that's so sad. Oh man, that's so sad and just messed up. That's rough.
awesome, though, but it also comes with a probably not even thought about assumption that going too far is some grave sin. You get other dwarves killed by way of incompetence, something like that. And yeah, sometimes that's the reason for the Slayer Oath. Sometimes the reason for taking the Slayer Oath, though, is because they lost too much money on Monday poker night, which is rather silly. Warhammer silly, but still silly. Every now and again, a young dwarf does try to seek to be a bit more forgiving, or weary elders try to lay down their arms, and then their gods themselves intervene. Once two dwarf holds were fighting each other for so long that they forgot what the original grudge was even about. When they went to forgive each other, a statue of their gods crashed on their heads, killing them. Grimnir demands you settle those grudges, and if you don't, he'll settle things permanently. Their non-stop self-destructive spiral is divinely mandated, so unlike most other Warhammer armies, don't think your homebrew army is going to get away from all the homegrown hatred the dwarves cultivate. Not unless you want every battle you fight to end with, and then Grimnir cursed my guys immediately. Their extreme conservatism doesn't help either. Dwarfs do not like new things. They constantly complain about how new dwarfs have it easy, and that mankind is far too unsafe with what it does and how it experiments, and that anything less than 500 years old is unreliable at best. To some extent, this is understandable.
Yeah,
they live longer lives and are proud craftsmen. It's undeniable their prototype stages and whatnot would be longer in the name of safety and quality. But most of them will complain almost violently at the slightest sign of someone deviating from how things are supposed to be, at the slightest whiff of a new idea. And yes, sometimes a dwarf engineer will quietly disappear into a room for a few weeks and come out with this invention he totally found in a basement somewhere and he definitely didn't just create. But by and large, anything like that is heavily shamed. Granted, it isn't 40k tech priest levels of new tech, but more so you will become a social pariah. Of course, if your newfangled contraption does go wrong and take dwarf lives, well, the Slayer Oath is right around the corner for you. I guess to sum up their attitudes is that I'm sure you've read a book or watched a movie or something where if a character would just pull their head out of their ass, they'd be fine. In the case of the dwarfs, you're supposed to be feeling like that all the time, because they refuse to pull their head out. On another related note to that last one specifically, the dwarfs also have a pretty hard set time limit on how long they have until they're basically out of the game. They are more advanced than anyone else, and in Gotrek and Felix, there's a book where Felix begins to understand just how far ahead that means when he sees a dwarf train, among other things. But technology is something that can be copied, learned, and replicated. The Skaven do that regularly, although that's a bit more questionable a topic, since Skaven engineering is always self-destructive, but mankind? The Empire is beginning its industrial revolution. Had the setting gone on a bit longer, the dwarfs would find themselves slowly but surely falling behind mankind as they eclipse even dwarf technology.
That's kind of sad.
And it's worse for the dwarfs than the elves, because at least the elves will always be better at magic than most others. Mankind will eventually invent better tech, however, because we do things faster than dwarfs, and then the dwarfs must either radically change their culture or become client states to mankind.
And they're not going to change their culture.
And last lore downside is rather meta, because at least in my reading, there are far less dwarf books than there are human or elf books. Now this is a bit deceiving. A lot of books such as Thanquil's have a good amount of point of view moments from dwarfs, and if you count Gotrek and Felix, there are more books about a dwarf character than anyone in Warhammer, 40k included. But for a single sit-down book all about dwarfs, there's certainly less than the other two main good guy factions, which is unfortunate, and certainly deserves a spot in the book for the lack of books. Dwarfs, in terms of getting into the nitty-gritty, don't have too many downsides, at least in what I'm willing to outright say. I'm not smart enough to go, this unit is overcosted by 15 points, and for that reason the dwarf sucks. You know, I'm not good at that sort of thing. However,
Neither
the flip
am I.
side of that is that the downsides the dwarfs have are brutal. First off is speed. The average dwarf is rocking up with a movement characteristic of 3 inches, and when you make the Death Guard
Ooh.
look fast, you know you're in for a
Oh,
special
that's
kind
bad.
of hell. No, the obvious downside is that you're slow as hell. Any kind of scenario involving you running down an enemy is an uphill battle, to say the least. Those miners and their special rule for coming in at the other ends of the table is something I experienced before. The other player put their dwarfs behind my army to presumably try and destroy my archers. I responded by moving my archers every turn, and they never reached me. The only way that kind of thing will ever work is if you as a dwarf player roll great on advance and charge rolls, and your opponent rolls nothing but 1s and 2s to advancing away from you. But this also is a problem based on how the old world specifically works. As the rank and flank game it is, changing the direction of your unit requires movement to do so. So if you improperly position your models, you can spend entire turns doing nothing but awkwardly wheeling units around and then feeling frustrated. Even your gyrocopter and bomber top out at 9 inches of movement, which isn't exactly breaking any speed records,
No.
especially for a flying unit. On the topic of speed, they aren't any faster once the fighting starts, because your initiative scores are universally low across the board. And when I say low, I mean that it's a moment of wonder and awe for a dwarf player when they get to hit at initiative 3 instead of 2. Assume in all instances that you will be fighting last in every single combat encounter, because even Ungrim, the chief slayer and therefore
At
melee
least you're hard
character,
to
only
hit,
has
like,
initiative
you're really
5.
tough.
There are some runes to mitigate this, but they're mitigating it, not turning your dwarf into the Flash. Moving down the list, you have no magical game, which as in lore may be more hindrance than help. While you can dispel enemy spells and they suffer on casting rolls, that latter part doesn't apply to any magical buffs your enemy provides themselves. An Anvil of Doom does have some runic magic it can use, but the funny thing about that thing is that it doesn't move. Once you put it on the battlefield, it can't move at all, only wheel. So if you want anything resembling magic, you're paying over 200 points minimum for a big brick. Otherwise, just enjoy getting pelted with fireballs while you can do nothing about it. It's also just a shame, you know? You pick the one army that doesn't get to cast spells. You have to just sit back and watch everyone else enjoy entire other phases of the game. You also have no cavalry or monsters, and no, the goddamn king getting carried around on a shield is not cavalry. This is both related to the speed issue and a shame on its own, because it also means you never have the option of an Unga Bunga giant smash monster to throw at the enemy. Having lost most of my old world games, and to dwarfs funnily enough, this isn't the worst hindrance in the world, at least if you're playing against an idiot like myself. But the moments you need a giant or your opponent isn't running theirs like a moron, you're gonna feel it. Special mention must be given to Slayers, however, in spite of how I opened this segment saying I wouldn't get too specific. They are indeed good in melee, but they're still dwarfs, so getting to melee is going to take time. And would you like to guess their armor save? Go on, take a guess really quick. Was their answer 0?
Yeah.
If your guess was 0, then congratulations, you're correct.
Mine
They
was
don't
gonna be
have
1.
Slayers are a decent enough distraction unit because once they get into melee, they'll be a problem, but getting into melee is the big sticking point. If your opponent rolls well for hitting and wounding, you kind of just have to accept that Grimnir will be awaiting them sooner than you probably hoped. A shame because they're the most flavorful unit in a dwarf army, but it is what it is. This one is less of a downside with dwarfs and more of a warning, but I beg of you, just don't fight Tomb Kings. Not because it's a bad matchup, but because
Ooh,
unless the
that's a
Tomb
cool
Kings player
model.
brings the Scorpion with the funny rule that kills everything that fails an initiative test against it, it's gonna be the most boring match of your life. The first 2 turns of the game will be both of you maneuvering your slow as hell infantry to the fight as both armies waddle across the field. After that, every turn goes as follows. The Tomb King's infantry kill 1 model of Dwarf Warriors. The Dwarf Warriors kill 5 Tomb King skeletons.
They come
the
back.
Lich Priest then resurrects 4 Tomb King skeletons. Rinse and repeat as you and your opponent stare at each other until someone either rolls absurdly well or the Tomb King's player loses his Lich Priest. Unless you really want to recreate the stalemate of
sounds
trench
rough.
warfare in a fantasy setting, just don't play that matchup. And the last tabletop downside is me going back on some of the words I said earlier. Most of the dwarf army holds up fine, and I'm not even going to count them all being similar as much of a downside. You want dwarfs, you probably want that uniformity, and there is just enough differences from unit to unit that you can tell what's at least different there. But the models that don't hold up, oh dear lord, do they not hold up. In fact, Slayers get the worst of that, too.
They
Look
look-
at those faces and the sculpts in general. I like to
They're
think I'm
bad.
not that much of a model snob, because quite
No,
frankly,
it's
when
bad.
people bitch about old world models, I usually just roll my eyes. How dare a rank and flank game not have the most dynamically posed models all looking like they're trying to outcompete each other to see who gets to be on the
Yeah,
cover
this
of the
looks
next Call of
gross.
Duty game. But some of these units, yeah, I get it. Maybe it's because I think the rest of the dwarfs are fine, but when something goes wrong here, boy howdy can you see it. Although I make an exception for the Imperial dwarfs. I love my meatball men. How could you
Oh,
not love the meatball
wow,
men?
I do
Though
like
I certainly
them.
don't love their $53 price tag, though. That one does not get love from me. And
Ooh.
those were the dwarfs of Warhammer Fantasy. Grim, resolute, angry little alcoholics that have come to inform you that because your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather slighted their dad, your entire home is now going to burn. Thank you
Oh.
as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the grudges to my dwarfs, giving me the strength and power I need
Give
to
that a
continue
like.
complaining about things that are at least in part my fault. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there.
That was a good video. I learned a lot about the dwarfs. I have to keep remembering to say it's dwarfs, not dwarves. So hard. If I like dwarfs more or elves, but I gotta say it's Legolas. Legolas in the book and the movie, but I saw the movie before I read the book. So yeah, you know, Orlando Bloom, he's a good looking guy, which is why I enjoy the elves.
Dowie, more like smelly, absolutely got them. Get bent, stunties, your precious beard will never be regrown because the swordmasters will continue to cut it off. Maybe if you wrap some of your books of grudges around your feet, you wouldn't be so short. Idiot. Stupid. Short. No, I'm not tall enough in real life to be saying this. I don't care. I can't tell if this...
Wow, you really got him. You really got him, Pank.